Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Until recently, I doubt most of us could place where Nagorno Karabakh was on a map. But last September, it was thrust before our eyes when the lingering conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia over the disputed territory was reignited. In 6 short weeks, Azeri forces launched a blistering attack on the Armenian breakaway province, forcing Armenia to capitulate and agree to a humiliating retreat. Over the next hour, we're going to look at what happened and its significant ramifications, not just for the region, but for the world. Here with us to discuss the conflict, we have Richard Giragosian, founder of the Regional Studies Center, an independent think tank in Yerevan. Previously, Richard served as an academic in Washington, D.C., and was a member of staff on the Joint Economic Committee of the US Congress. Hello, Richard. I think you're there. Maybe just a question of microphones. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you.
Also joining us from Berlin, we have Emin Milli, an Azeri dissident, political analyst, and human rights activist, who's was perhaps most famous for being imprisoned in Azerbaijan for his criticisms of the government there. He now lives in exile in Germany. It's not you're doing other things now as well, Emin, aren't you?
Yeah, I started my own YouTube show, which is called Better Days, and it's about basically thinking together with Azerbaijanis living all over the world, how we can improve our life as individuals, society, and as a state.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I'm going to be coming to more of those thoughts in a second as we develop the conversation here about the conflict as well. But to start with, we're going to roll back time to the late 1980s. I think this is really necessary to try and get an understanding of what's happened in the last year. Just to give a brief recap of what has happened, or what happened back then as the Soviet Union was breaking up. Richard, can I just start with you? We'll try and keep this fairly short. Just take us back then to the late 80s. What happened then? Talk a bit about the tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Obviously, the conflict, the disputed claims over Nagorno-Karabakh go some way back into the 19th century. But if you could just take us back to the late 80s.
Well, if we look at the late 80s, what we saw in Gorbachev's waning days of the Soviet Union, a period of glasnost, perestroika, an unexpected openness that actually tended to encourage, if not exacerbate, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh to break away from Azerbaijan and in many ways take advantage of the environment in the waning days of the Soviet Union, seeking self-determination. What's most important, however, though, is that the conflict erupted as an issue and as a conflict well before the independence of either Armenia or Azerbaijan. It predates modern statehood, meaning that this conflict tended to define and actually, in many ways, distort political development, impede democracy, and distort economic reform. What this means is it's a legacy conflict that Armenia and Azerbaijan, as post-Soviet independent states, have struggled to overcome.
Okay, so it's deep-seated, deep-rooted. But just remind us, Emin, can you, if you can, what actually happened when the conflict broke out? Let's bring up a map as well. If we can just bring up a map to give us an all idea where we're talking about. If Isabel could do that while Emin is talking. Here we are.
I want to tell you from my personal experience, so you understand. In 84, 85, I was in kindergarten. I just started going to the school. So, you know, my first love in kindergarten was Armenian girl. Her name was Susanna. My first friend in school, his name was Karen. So my father had a lot of Armenian friends in Baku, and that was the moment, you know, when the conflict started with this perestroika and glasnost, because the conflict which was there, you know, 100 years ago when, you know, these independent republics of Armenia, Azerbaijan lost their sovereignty and Bolsheviks came, then Bolsheviks, you know, solved the territorial issues in a certain way. And, you know, parties, it was top-down decision and everyone accepted it. I mean, there was some frustration, but it was accepted. So when perestroika glasnost came, there are a lot of my family kind of witnesses, but also a lot of some academic witness that a lot of Azerbaijans and Armenians in Azerbaijan and Armenia, but also all over Soviet Union, they lived in peace, and there was not, so all this.
You didn't see yourselves as having competing identities.
Yeah, and I think the problem appeared when suddenly perestroika and glasnost came, which we all wanted to come, but it created a situation where you had very powerful nationalistic ideas, coming and basically spreading like wildfire.
Yeah.
And then we couldn't, for example, in Baku understand why Armenians do not want to live with us, because as I said, like my father had a lot of Armenian friends. They were all in high positions. The Armenians are very talented people, very smart people. So no matter where they live, they end up, in the elite. They are, they always, and that was the case also in Azerbaijan.
Okay, well, so, I think that's underlines how mixed people were, ethnically living within the Soviet Union. Let's look at this map. Maybe Richard, you could talk about what actually happened in the conflict itself. In Armenia was the more dominant, more technically capable force, better trained. Am I right in saying?
Well, yes. If we look at the military context, what we see is an initial victory by the Armenian side in the late 80s, early 90s, up until a ceasefire of 94. The Armenian breakaway enclave, Nagorno Karabakh, which is the core of the conflict, also expanded to include many districts of Azerbaijan proper that were seized by the Armenian side in terms of a so-called buffer zone. All of these territories have been regained recently in the war by Azerbaijan. And I would say this demonstrates the diplomatic lost opportunity. These districts were long the only bargaining chips for Armenia as a concession to Azerbaijan. And unfortunately, it's an indictment that diplomacy and the peace process failed miserably with the loss of life.
Okay.
But if we look at the map, it's as complex as the conflict itself. And unfortunately, it's very confusing as well.
Let's, while we've got this map up here, Isabel, I don't know if you can see, within that pink zone, there is a sort of an orange outline. That is Nagorno Karabakh in the middle within that pink area. Yeah. So within the pink zone, if you can see that smaller sort of area outlined inside the pink area, where you see that is Nagorno Karabakh. And what the Azeris did is they created this buffer zone. Sorry, the Armenians did. They created this buffer zone and took a whole swathe of Azeri territory, so that Nagorno Karabakh is actually joined up with Armenia proper. Let's go to the next map, and this might look pretty confusing. But Richard, maybe can you just say how quickly this proceeded? The highlighted green area is essentially the area that the Azeris took between the end of September and the early parts of November, all that light green area. So a significant advance, a very, very rapid, really a rapid defeat for the Armenian forces. How did that happen, Richard?
Well, I would say to a large degree, much of that light green southern area were Azerbaijani districts that were retaken and restored. And then in the waning days of the conflict, of the war, the Azerbaijanis were able to capture the second largest city, Shushi, in Nagorno-Karabakh. And that's when a Russian-imposed ceasefire was accepted by all parties as a cessation to hostilities. What we now see, according to the map, is a complicated process of border delineation, demarcation. That actually is now the challenge. But militarily, if we look at the new landscape, the new map, Armenia, in many ways, was, I would say, dramatically shown that the myth of invincibility no longer applied. In other words, Armenia, in many ways, militarily thought it was Israel, but was really the Palestinians. in terms of weakness and incompetence militarily. But this post-war Russian-imposed ceasefire is not a settlement. And hopefully now we will resume diplomatic negotiations over post-war stability. But at the same time, it is a demonstrably new landscape and a new map that is redefining much of the region.
Richard, can you talk a bit, without going into too much detail, about the technical side of the conflict? Because this is one of the things that is really quite stunning, is the change in the type of warfare, and also the backing of the Azeri forces by Turkey, the very close link between the two.
Well, I'm also a former instructor for the U.S. Army Special Forces. And from a military point of view, the Azerbaijanis very commendably performed very well. But at the same time, there was a reliance on an unprecedented direct Turkish role in support with the deployment of UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, which was decisive in many ways, as well as an uncharacteristically passive Russian response. But at the same time, I think the Armenians greatly underestimated the Azerbaijani military capability, but it was also Turkey that actually saw this as part of Turkey's bolder reassertion of power and influence in the broader context. I think for the Azerbaijani side, they're in a precarious position, caught in between Turkey and Russia. And it is precarious because there is somewhat of a rivalry between Moscow and Ankara that may be dangerous going forward. But militarily, I think the Armenians were victim to a degree of gross overconfidence and believing in invincibility that really didn't apply. But finally, the most dangerous precedent, in my opinion, is it dangerously legitimizes the use of force as a solution to an inherently political conflict. This is why a return to diplomacy, I think, is very necessary.
Okay, I want to come back to that in a second and develop those ideas in a moment, but I still want to focus on the actual conflict itself, because the pace of it and the astonishing defeat was quite significant. Emin, were you surprised by what Azerbaijan was able to do?
I think that, somehow all analysts could see that the power of balance will change towards Azerbaijan. It was the former Armenian president, Levon Ter-Petrosyan, who in 90s, after the victory actually, said that we must make the peace with Azerbaijan. And he appealed to the people of Armenia with the article saying we have to make the peace deal now, because if we're not going to do it now, then in 20 years, Azerbaijan will be much stronger than Armenia, and we won't be able to get what we can get now. But what happened, he was overthrown. So Armenian society didn't accept it. The Karabakh clan has overthrown Levon Ter-Petrosyan and that thinking in politics in Armenia. And then hardliners came to power. There was also the attempt when Demircan, another politician who wanted to make, he was also killed in the parliament of Armenia. It all happened in the 90s. So since then, you had a very position, very hardliners in power in Armenia who wouldn't even accept that 7 regions or 5 regions around, Nagorno Karabakh should go back to Azerbaijan as part of solution, and then negotiation should continue. And then it was actually, in 2018, the Prime Minister of Armenia, Pashinyan, where many people in Azerbaijan hope maybe he will be more, coming in, democratic way. He's not Karabakh clan, his journalist background, maybe he will be more, empathetic, but he ended up, I think, and Richard can correct me, but for internal politics purposes, he became even more hardliner. And he said things that no other hardliner Karabakh clan president said. He said, Karabakh is Azerbaijan, period, which made the entire discussion and negotiations of last 20, 30 years irrelevant. And also the Minister of Defense of Armenia, it was in 2019, so about a year ago, he said, we actually do not want to trade those, some Azerbaijan territories for peace. We want actually now a war for new territories. So, but again, the actually idea that Azerbaijan is much stronger, its military budget is much stronger, its relationship with Russia has improved over, since 90s. Its relationship with Turkey has improved, because in 90s, Turkey, the president of Elchibey, then when Azerbaijan, there were hundreds of thousands of refugees leaving all these territories that were occupied by Armenian forces. The president of Azerbaijan, Elchibey back then, democratically elected president, asked Süleyman Demirel, the leader of Turkey back then, can you give us 5 helicopters? We want to save refugees because Kelbejar is occupied. We need to save lives. Turkey didn't help us, because Turkey, despite of being, culturally, ethnically, linguistically, very close to us, like Russia, Ukraine, or Belarus, Russia, they didn't help us. Now it was, I think, a lot of work that made Turkey and Azerbaijan close. And it was also a lot of work, which I think diplomacy and politics and business that, convinced Russia, Russia intervened at the end, of the war. But for quite a long time, within these 44 days, Russia basically stayed neutral, which actually, exposed I think the problem with Armenia's security strategy.
Okay,
Armenia
just to recap a little bit, the failure of diplomacy over the years, the continued reliance on sort of nationalist tropes, including the more reformist government that was elected in 2018 in Armenia, and then Azerbaijan's enormous oil wealth. And I've noted the enormous investment it's put into its military. And I do want to stick with this last point about the military side of the conflict, because I do think it's significant. Richard, because some people watching this won't know about the use of UAVs. They won't know that Azerbaijan knocked out all of Armenia's radar systems more or less in one go. And they won't know that basically ground troops on the Armenian side became redundant because they were just being hit by UAVs consistently. So in terms of the actual change in the style of warfare, this was pretty significant, wasn't it, Richard?
Yeah, yes, for the first time, we saw a very effective introduction, deployment, and utility of air power. But what's important is also to be a little more specific. This was a war between the Armenian armed forces of Nagorno Karabakh with Armenian support and Azerbaijan with Turkish support. Armenia proper, its armed forces were not fully engaged or deployed. Part of it was out of fear that Turkey would intervene and that it may trigger Azerbaijani attacks on Armenia proper. Azerbaijan was usually very careful in avoiding a direct attack on Armenia proper. Rather, this was a war for Nagorno-Karabakh and the districts, and it represented a new battle space. The use of drone warfare was not only very effective, but decisive. It also exposed what Emin has pointed to, the fundamental weakness of Armenia militarily, in over-reliance on Russia and the security guarantee, but an underwhelming performance where much of the Azerbaijani advance was met with Armenian retreat. There was little in terms of counterattack or counteroffensive. And I think Armenia was very much militarily prepared to fight the last war, not prepared to wage this war.
Okay, well,
now the other question to conclude, though, is what this means for Armenia. Armenia today still has no diplomatic strategy and has yet to reassess defense reform. I think Armenia is dangerously running out of time. The government is under pressure. And what this means for the future of what remains of Nagorno-Karabakh, and also how Armenia is able to learn the lessons from this war, which unfortunately, I'm somewhat critical of the Armenian government's post-war performance.
Yeah, Richard, you've spoken about, and I can share these materials with anybody watching, the long-term instability that's expected from this with Armenia. And there was a lot of hope put in that new government elected in 2018. It was seen as a color revolution, and the Russian commentators who are very, rubbing their hands with glee to see the losses that the Armenian reformers have had in front of their eyes. Emin, where does this leave the region? Let's step back just a bit. Soon we're going to bring in questions from people, and we'll be having questions across the board. There is Turkey, there is Russia, but let's start with Turkey. What do you think Turkey wanted out of this? Turkey gave Azerbaijan enormous military backing. It provided essentially the UAVs. There's some stories that said those UAVs are actually being commanded from Turkey. There's certainly Azeri military being trained in Turkey on those UAVs throughout the summer. What did Turkey hope to achieve here?
Well, I think, first of all, Azerbaijan was buying this weaponry not just from Turkey, it was buying it from Turkey and Israel. So Israel was another very important ally of Azerbaijan for many, many years. Azerbaijan is one of few, countries with, Muslim majority populations that has, I think has the closest ties with Israel. Because there was for a long time Jewish community in Azerbaijan, which was living very well for centuries. And so what Turkey wanted? I mean, Turkey, that Turkey's policy has shifted, and Turkey has this expansive policy, and it sees itself, protecting its own interests. Sometimes some analysts say that it had to take this new role that was not the role they had 5 or 10 years ago. So it's something new for Turkey too. I think for Erdogan, like internally, because Azerbaijan and Turkey, these are very close countries. Like it's they come from the same Turkic tribes, like the Russia, Ukraine and Belarus come from Slavic tribes. So here we have several Turkic countries, and Turkey and Azerbaijan are the closest. And when Erdogan supports Azerbaijan on such level, of course, he gets a lot of internal support within Turkey. And considering the difficult economic times in Turkey as well, so it's very good for Erdogan politically, like purely internally. But then also, geopolitically, I think both Putin and Erdogan have, benefited a lot from this kind of reconfiguration of geopolitics in South Caucasus, because US and European Union have been completely sidelined. And this is, this is what Putin likes. This is what Erdogan likes. And I think that what actually worries me now, I think that there is kind of attitude in US and Europe now that, okay, we have not been involved in, resolution of this conflict within the last 2-3 months. So let now Turkey, Russia just, pick up the bill, use all their soft power tools to help actually to rebuild trust between Armenia and Azerbaijan and develop economic cooperation, do a lot of other things. And I hope this will not stay a permanent policy of European Union and of US, because, from Azerbaijan perspective, I think, geopolitical weather can change very fast. In 90s, Armenians were lucky. Now Azerbaijan was lucky. But I think we should not make the mistake that Armenia made 30 years ago, that when they had the upper hand, they just, as a government, they decided that we're going to be, arrogant and we won and we're not going to do anything to rebuild the trust. I really, I'm really hopeful that Azerbaijani government now pushes this economic cooperation with Armenia. I believe that if we ever have a chance to rebuild the bridges, to rebuild trust, it will happen through economic cooperation. And these communication lines are now being opened. For the first time in January, you had ministers of national security of chief of services, it's called, but they met in Armenia without even mediators, which I think is is a huge progress. And so these negotiations, I hope, will lead to developing trade between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And it's going to be very difficult, especially in Armenia, because anyone who talks about some kind of cooperation with Azerbaijan is considered as a traitor in Armenia now, if I understand correctly, and Richard can correct me, exactly like in 90s and later last 30 years, anyone in Azerbaijan who would speak about cooperation with Armenia would be considered as a traitor.
Yeah,
but I hope we will find a way to overcome this,
I think from what both of you are saying, this all underlines the fact that what happened on the 10th of November was really essentially a ceasefire. There was no real deal. But also to address the point, Turkey clearly hoped to have a military advantage, a geostrategic advantage in the region. But it really looks like that Russia has stepped into that position. Is it an easy, Russia must relish it, Richard. What does it get out of it? And then after you've answered this question, we'll bring in questions from the group. So please, everybody else, please start putting your questions in the Q&A box below. So Richard, what do the Russians get out of this?
Well, as we see, we have a Russian-imposed agreement. We also have a unilateral Russian deployment of peacekeepers that are actually much more than peacekeepers. They're peacemakers. Much of the security, safety of the Armenian population of Nagorno Karabakh is now looking to 2,000 Russian peacekeepers for reassurance. But I would say Russia is somewhat dangerously overextended for two reasons. One is, once this initial honeymoon period wears off, the Russians may become targets from all sides in terms of their deployment. And unfortunately, there is a threat of a scenario where Nagorno-Karabakh seeks to become a Russian protectorate. This is a bigger geopolitical battle that leads to the second danger or risk for Moscow, and that is a clash with Turkey, because in many ways, Turkey was led to expect much more of a direct role in the post-war situation, and Azerbaijan is very prudent, is very correctly cautious in what a Russian presence means. Because if we look at Russian peacekeepers elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, once they deploy, they never go home. And it is a potentially destabilizing fact. However, where we are today, I think part of the reason we haven't been able to overcome the emotional impact of this war on the Armenian side is because the exchange of prisoners is still incomplete. We need to actually facilitate an acceleration of the exchange of prisoners of war and civilian hostages in order then to move forward and move on. But for example, in the coming days, the deputy prime ministers of Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan will be meeting to further the planned reopening and reintegration of trade and transport and energy, which is an inherently positive development.
Yeah, okay. So I'm very interested in that. And how do you actually come up with ways to try and secure a peace, as it all sounds incredibly fragile? Let's bring in those questions now. Simon Jackson to start with, followed by Jonathan. Simon Jackson, go ahead.
Hi. Do the Iranians have a dog in this fight, given that it's all going on immediately over their back fence?
Emin, Iran ruled the region at one point.
Yeah, this is maybe many viewers here will not know, but actually there are more Azerbaijanis or Azerbaijani Turks living in Iran than in Azerbaijan Republic. So the Azerbaijanis in Iran are a big minority. It's not even minority. It's very debated, the number from 20 million to 40 million. So it's a big chunk of Iran is actually populated by Azerbaijanis or Azerbaijani Turks. And so yes, this was always, and then there is every 50 years, there is a revolution for independence, So the last time it was in 40s after the Second World War, which was, violently put down by back then the Shah regime. And so of course this conflict it's very interesting because I think Iranian government always supported Armenia, and they were very cautious because any kind of, if Azerbaijan is not failed state, if Azerbaijan succeeds to become strong, state and maybe democratic state one day, so it's a big problem for Iran, because there are millions and millions of Azerbaijanis who will get inspired by that. So
the question really, you've inverted Simon's question in a way, which is not what is the risk to the Southern Caucasus, it's what the risk is to Iran.
Yeah, but I just wanted, it was introduction, and then to answer Simon's question directly, Iran stayed neutral. I mean, there was some reports which it's hard to check, that they were sending something to Armenia or not. But overall, I think Iran stayed neutral in this latest war. And also it needs to be said, Richard said many things about the recent war, which, by the way, I recommend to read War on the Rocks. If you Google War on the Rocks, Armenia, Azerbaijan, there was some amazing articles about really military strategy and the content of this warfare, what happened and so on. So a lot of military analysts around the world now study, what happened between Armenia and Azerbaijan within these 44 days. And Iran's position was they stayed out of it. But then there was interesting, when Erdogan was in Baku, there was a military parade, victorious, parade, something that you don't have anymore in Europe, in Western Europe and US. I mean, Trump maybe wanted to introduce it, but he didn't have time probably. This happened. And then Erdogan said a poem, which was kind of hinting on kind of this, that Azerbaijanis are split between Iran and Azerbaijan. And there was, I think, some very high-level Iranian government officials. They were furious. They went on Twitter, which became now a popular platform, not just in US, to vent your frustration. And they really expressed a lot of protest to Turkey, actually, because it's very sensitive. So, but what's interesting is that Ilham Aliyev and Azerbaijani government and pro-Azerbaijani media on this conflict between Iran and its kind of protest against Erdogan's speech at a military parade in Baku, the Ilham Aliyev and Azerbaijani government and pro-government Azerbaijani media didn't comment at all. Like there was a total awkward silence because everyone in Azerbaijan knows how explosive is this topic. So,
they don't really want to see
Iran's territory.
Yeah,
we don't think it's a good security strategy in Azerbaijan.
No, okay, got it. Okay, let's bring in a question. I think it's Jonathan, maybe, is it Jonathan Armitage? I can just see Jonathan, I'm guessing. Jonathan, do you want to open your microphone?
You are correct, it is me.
There you go. Where are you, Jonathan?
I'm in Aspen.
So I didn't hear these.
I'm in Aspen, Colorado.
Aspen, Colorado, great. Go ahead and ask a question, go on.
I was interested whether you think this war, inverted commas, would have happened if the US had not begun to withdraw out of that, I'll say, the Middle East and the area you're talking about, and particularly over the last 4 years.
Richard, do you want to take that?
Sure. From an American perspective, and also because it's coming from America, it's a good question. I would say, yes, you're quite right, Jonathan. Part of the calculation has been based on the U.S. disengagement from this region over several years, under Obama as much as under Trump.
Right.
And that's what prompted Turkey to actually feel confident and comfortable as a NATO member to move in support of Azerbaijan. But I think Emin would agree with me. The bigger question is, war was inevitable in terms of Azerbaijan's justified frustration from the lack of progress in the diplomatic peace process. It was only a matter of time. But yes, one calculation was not just Russian passivity in response, but U.S. absence. And now there is an opportunity under President Biden for the U.S. as well as the EU to invest and re-engage in the post-war stability operation.
I think this is a really interesting and really critical question. And I know we've got more questions coming up, but I'm just going to slip one in here. What leverage do the Europeans and the US have there? Emin, to start with you, because I know you've talked about trying to get economic cooperation. You've made the comparison with Europe after the Second World War. It was only by France and Germany having the Steel and Coal Pact that you built the blocks of a future peace, and that really Armenia and Azerbaijan should be doing the same thing. But isn't the EU too far away? And really, this is Russia's backyard.
I think, you know, one of the most known experts on our region, Tom DeVal, he wrote recently as well, and he in New York Times and other publications, that yeah, it looks like awkward kind of for West, for EU and US to work now with Russia and Turkey in Karabakh, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, to help to build the peace and to contribute to stability and development of these bilateral relationships. But there is no other way, really. I mean, I know, I've been talking recently with a lot of politicians, experts in US, in European Union, and there is this mood here, why should we pick up the bill? Because there is, to do this well, it's only US and EU have these very extensive soft power tools that could help to solve the problems that most probably Azerbaijan, Armenia on their own cannot solve, and Russia and Turkey do not have this kind of tools, and experience.
I mean, I guess the typical leverage with the European Union is trade and giving both sides access to European markets in some way or other.
Let me give you one more example. Like recently, really, U.S. Congress adopted they adopted a budget, so there was a commitment from U.S. government side to give $250 million to support economic cooperation and business project between Israel and Palestine. So I envision, for example, in good case scenario, like, I don't know, several years later, we have a situation where, for example, US government will step in and support the kind of this, peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan. For example, in this way, EU has many tools. There are many ways how it can be done.
Let me put that question another way. What kind of leverage could have been used in the last 4 years or even before that would have helped prevent this from the US?
Well,
let me ask Richard's perspective on that one.
From Azerbaijan perspective, and Richard mentioned it a bit, for 30 years, Azerbaijan tried to negotiate, and Armenia just became more hardline. And then I think there was also this summer, there were protests in Azerbaijan demanding from Aliyev to take back the occupied territories. So there was a lot of pressure. I think someone asked me the question, like, did I expect this war? Yeah, everyone was expecting it, but on the other hand, it was still quite unexpected. The victory was unexpected. The beginning of the war was unexpected. So, and I think that the EU and US, what they missed, like from a Georgian perspective, and I understand that's not US or EU kind of, we cannot blame EU or US or Russia for it. In fact, there was Lavrov plan, which is foreign minister of Russia, who were trying to convince Armenia to leave, to liberate at least 5 regions of Karabakh, so there could be a progress, so some other things could be discussed.
Yeah.
But Armenia always refused, and then it was inevitable,
Richard, you agree with that? Is that an analysis you agree with? I mean, that there wasn't much to be done by the US or others? I mean, that the diplomacy tried and failed.
Generally, yes. The U.S. didn't have the leverage, let's be honest. It couldn't even influence Turkey, which is a NATO member. Moreover, the EU tried Eastern Partnership, etc., and just couldn't incentivize peace over, unfortunately, force of arms. But I think even Russia is looking to the European Union now to come in and to actually invest more in post-war stability. And I think this plays to the strength, not the weakness of the EU.
Okay, let's move on a bit. Let's take some more questions now. So Bernard O'Brien. Bernard, are you there?
Yes, thanks, Nicholas. Yes, I do have a question. I think this one will be for Richard. The stunning success of the mass use of drones in this war, I think the very first major battlefield use as compared to, taking out spies, as it were. And I also read, I think yesterday or the day before, the British government has put forward a contract with a Belfast company, about 100 million, I think it is, to invest in, I think it's something called wingman drones that would actually fly with fighter planes as well. Be very interested in your comments, more from, I guess, a defence budget perspective. What's going to happen to these incredibly expensive fighter planes and investments that the British government and the American government does in fighter planes? Will they become obsolete quite quickly?
Bernard, I'm going to chip in here. We are planning a talk. We haven't confirmed the time or the date yet. Tim Ripley, who's written for Jane's Defence, he's a very, very well-known British defence analyst, will be joining us in February, basically to look at how warfare has changed and how fundamentally a huge sort of tectonic shift in warfare has taken. And this is possibly the first time we have seen UAVs used in this way, and this changing the nature of conflict. Having said that, Richard, what have you got to say?
Well, I used to cover the region for Jane's, actually, for many years. Now I'm looking at this issue with Chatham House and RUSI, the Royal Uniformed Services Institute. And basically, I think Bernard raises a very disturbing trend here. This breakthrough in warfare, where the Azerbaijani victory and the effective use of drone warfare is also a big promotional victory for Turkish producers of the drones, who are now selling this to the Ukrainians. It's also dangerous in terms of how this affects the rules of engagement. And you're right in pointing out budget prioritization. It's going to shift away from fixed-wing aircraft into these more asymmetrical, non-conventional, predator-style attack drones. And coupled with artificial intelligence, this is probably the new trend. Just as we went from the battleship or the HMS Dreadnought to the aircraft carrier, this may portend a significant applicable trend in military warfare, but it also raises concerns over rules of engagement. Since these drones are piloted thousands or miles, kilometers away with little oversight.
Yes, I mean, can you talk perhaps about there was the footage there of people just being plucked away from the trenches, and it does make tanks and armored personnel carriers look redundant.
Well, yes, target selection as well as the effective assault, if you will. But what also worries me is this may spiral into a more devastating arms race, just as a time coming out of COVID where we need to invest more in everything from education to public health. This is perhaps the wrong development at the wrong time.
I mean, you can imagine the use of these vehicles in somewhere like Pakistan and India, where the conflict has been held along very sort of traditional artillery and infantry.
Well, I'm worried about Taiwan. I'm worried about the Chinese assessment from, believe it or not, of all places, Nagorno Karabakh. It's the Chinese PLA, the military, People's Liberation Army, that's actually studying this conflict. And I'm worried that the wrong lessons will emerge.
Yeah, no, it's all very, very worrying. Nigel Harley, let's bring in Nigel Harley. Go ahead, Nigel.
Thanks, Lou. given the very poor state of the Turkish economy, even before COVID, and the fact that Turkey has become more and more involved in various fronts in the region, Libya being a good example, what about, one might imagine that their lines in this conflict in Azerbaijan may be a bit stretched. And if that was the case, if Turkey was to suddenly withdraw, what do our experts feel would be the effect of that?
I mean, is Turkey in danger of overextending itself? It's already involved in Syria. It's already involved in Libya. It seems to be using its military to sort of back up its foreign policy aims, quite effectively.
No, we have seen geopolitical weather changing in the region, okay, for last, I don't know, 100, 150 years. You had changes, and so in 90s, again, as I said, there was a total different situation that Turkey wouldn't even help with several helicopters to save some Azerbaijan refugees who were running away from, Armenian occupation. And so that was that situation, because Turkish government back then was very concerned about how NATO would react. Today, Erdogan is not concerned how NATO will react. And actually, he is, I think Erdogan and Putin are playing this game, and Putin wants him to draw out of NATO. And Erdogan is, I think, kind of, is flirting with the idea, let's put it this way. But how far it can go, it was very astonishing for me actually to hear Putin talking about relationship between Turkey and Russia in a way, because the Russian journalists were asking, but the Turkey is a country with whom we had most of our wars. Like, how can you be allied with Turkey? And he was saying, but Putin's answer was, but we look at Germany and France. They had so many wars, and then they created this union, and now they're living in peace. So it is really, interesting how things are changing. And basically, I think especially Putin, Russia, and Turkey, they love trolling the West. When there was this attack on Capitol, I think the Turkish government released, I think it was a tweet saying like, we actually recommend Turkish citizens in Washington, D.C. not to go to the areas where they protest. It's dangerous for your health. So, and Putin trolling like this, basically, the West. This is a new reality. This is where we are now. And I think Turkey can, Erdogan can, lose power. Other forces can come to power in Turkey. Situations can always change. That's why I'm advocating for involving US and European Union. And I hope that they will really step in and get rid of this complex, we have been sidelined, we have lost nothing there. Because if ambition is really to help to support peace and development and stability, in South Caucasus, in this actually quite important region, for European Union, because of some alternative gas, oil comes from here. And, as we have seen, as Richard described, something that happened between Armenia and Azerbaijan militarily is influencing basically the entire strategic thinking of how warfares are waged, globally right now. And, UK government is trying now, is thinking about buying drones from Turkey. Like, as Richard said, China is rethinking its strategy. So even these small conflicts, which have been seen as insignificant, they start to have, this kind of effects that goes globally.
Yeah, it's, of course, just to remind everyone, it's an incredibly important region in terms of the oil supplies, with the pipelines coming out of Azerbaijan, coming into Turkey. So that there's obvious strategic significance there. Richard, two questions for you. What would you like the Biden administration to do? But also, how do you think they will be influenced by this conflict? So two slightly different questions.
Well, the first answer is more positive. Having served in the Senate, President Biden is an old friend, and I'm a Democrat. There is already a commitment to assessing how best for the US to re-engage in this region. What's interesting, however, is there is a unique opportunity here. Russia continues in this issue, on this conflict. Russia is working with the West and not against the West. There is a rare convergence of interest between Washington and Moscow in terms of post-war stability. It's something we can work with and build upon, meaning that the US re-engagement is not zero-sum. It's not necessarily a provocation against Russia. The second thing in terms of a lesson learned is this is the price of benign neglect by the West. The other lesson as an American is Armenia as an infant democracy since a nonviolent revolution in 2018 was defeated by two authoritarian countries, Azerbaijan and Turkey, and was saved by a third authoritarian country, Russia. This does not bode well for democracy, which is now in Armenia imperiled and is seen as not good enough to actually have anyone come to Armenia's defense. Right or wrong, it's the perception that matters more than reality.
I saw some calls within the Armenian press for Armenia to look to other powers, to look to China, to Iran as well. How much credibility do you give that?
Not much. I mean, first, we have to be a little more realistic in terms of inward reflection. We have to deal with what we have and no longer invest or believe in myths of ideology. What this wake-up call also means is self-sufficiency in terms of economic development and democracy being the key to real national security. I'm much more worried about Azerbaijan, to be honest. The father-to-son dynasty in Baku, where the Aliyev father and son have ruled the country for over a quarter of a century, they don't have nationalism or the conflict as a political tool anymore. I'm a little bit worried about the implications for the security and stability in Azerbaijan going forward.
Okay, I mean, that's slightly ironic, but it's certainly the situation in Armenia is going to be pretty unstable. I mean, I'm right in saying that the Speaker of the Parliament was lynched?
Well, that was due to the guilt or culpability of the Armenian government for failing to prepare the population for the inevitable loss. And I do think that temporary emotional reaction and the shock of the defeat is wearing off. If the government of Armenia was going to be overthrown or replaced, it would have already. We are now moving to early elections, and the opposition, because it's largely discredited, coming from the old regime, has little popularity. But my frustration is Armenia seems to be too slow in accepting a new reality and adjusting its diplomatic strategy going forward.
Okay, Emin, would you agree with Richard's analysis of Azerbaijan, that the father-to-son dynasty doesn't have much time left, relying on nationalism is no longer there because it's essentially won the conflict with Nagorno Karabakh and it has to move on?
Well, I think that, something that was quite surprising during this war for a lot of people, first of all, within Azerbaijan, that, there were so many reports about corruption, about ineffectiveness of government, and so many reports. But then, despite of all of this, the Azerbaijan army performed within, and you need to think about it. This war, it was 44 days war. 44 days, just, and there were about 5,000 people who died from both sides, soldiers, maybe about around 100 civilians, unfortunately. So all of this is unfortunate. But then if you compare what happened during this 44 days war with what happened 30 years ago, where the war continued for years, there were, 100,000 of refugees, and there was basically human cost. It was about 30,000 people.
Mm.
You know? So if you and I, you know, for me myself, it was a bit of shock that actually, you know, it goes back to, you know, Sparta and Athens, like what is stronger, democracy, you know, or authoritarian system? Who can win who? What is more effective? And I think that we have these debates and challenges, like, you know, what happened with Eastern Asian countries, with, you know, the rise of Singapore and China, that they are challenging the certain fundamentals that only democracies can flourish and develop. And here again, you know, despite of all the problems Azerbaijan had, it turned out to be in a better position, more powerful position. And yes, money was important, but, you know, money was not the only thing. We all know how, you know, when Israel had a war with several Arab states, you know, maybe Arab states had more money, but, you know, Israel won the war. So it's not just about money. There are also other factors. There is also geopolitics. I think it's very difficult in a region where you have Turkey and Russia to be a democracy, you know. But it's not just about democracy. As I said, the problem with Armenia we had is just, and then Richard mentioned it, there were certain ideas, myths that people in Armenia believed, you know. And then my biggest, always something I never understood, this security strategy of Armenia, right? I mean, when in 90s, even when all this started, Armenia had this territorial claims to Georgia, to Azerbaijan, to Turkey, and you know, Levon Petrosyan back then stopped the territorial claims toward you know, Georgia. With Azerbaijan, it didn't stop. And I think, I really hope, and we have internal in Azerbaijan between our friends, like, what can we do actually to help Armenia to see that actually your enemies could turn into your allies? It is possible. It happened, you know, throughout human history. And I think the best security strategy for Armenia and for Azerbaijan would be getting closer to each other, developing economic cooperation. Because if you start talking about history, like, we will never come to kind of some terms, you know, because we always will have different perspectives. But if we start developing economic ties, you know, and what actually is happening now, I mean, I don't know, maybe Richard can tell me. I know it's more difficult in Armenia, but it happens now in a very authoritarian way. You know, it actually happens from top down, and it's part of negotiations now. The papers have been signed. But I think just states doing this alone is not enough. I think it's very important for civil society leaders, for European Union, for US, to help both in Armenia and Azerbaijan with different programs, with different kind of policies, to make this happen. Because without
we're running out of time, Emin, and I've just got to get one more question in from Ruth Campbell. So Ruth, ask your question. Go ahead, Ruth. Ruth, you there? You just need to unplug your mic.
Yeah, okay. Yes, am I online now?
Yeah, you're there, yeah.
Yeah, great. I think my question segues well from what Amin's just been saying, which is the Turkish involvement in this conflict seen as having any implications for the long-running Turkish-Armenia border dispute?
Richard, briefly on that, what are the possibilities on that, Richard?
Well, Ruth raises an interesting point, because Turkey closed the border with Armenia in the 90s because of Nagorno Karabakh and the conflict. Now that the conflict has changed, Turkey has much less of a justification to keep the border closed. I also expect the border to reopen as part of the broader effort to restore regional trade and transport. Moreover, it's also a deal between Russia and Turkey, where the stars are aligning, and it seems likely as part of the bigger picture. And I do hope it becomes a win-win to lift all boats economically.
Okay, I'm going to do something very unfair as we wrap up. I want you to try and distill your observations from this conflict into about 3 or 4 fundamental points. I mean, I can say off the top of my head that the nature of warfare seems to fundamentally changed, that you're in danger of seeing an even more multipolar world in which the US and the EU's power seem to be waning unless they do something about it. Turkey is not as powerful as it thinks. Russia is, has got a better foothold in the region, but at what cost? Those are my thoughts. What do you want to say in addition to it? Go on, Richard.
Well, let me start by saying Armenia and Azerbaijan were at war well before September. We were fighting a war against a shared enemy, COVID-19. That war is not over. We still have a challenge of economic recovery and a demand for good governance and accountability. Moreover, at the same time, this conflict is not over. It needs to be resolved more than a ceasefire. Prisoner exchange, return of civilian hostages, and a beginning to a return to normalcy. My third point is, in conclusion, there is no conclusion. This is very much a dynamic, not static process. Okay,
Emin, briefly, what do you think?
Yeah, for me is the biggest question is, I am tired of this conflict, and I want our generation to see, if not the end of this conflict, but the beginning of getting out of this conflict. And for me, there are 2 important issues here. One is Armenia's security strategy. I really hope that all friends of Armenia, allies, and also people in Azerbaijan who are interested in Armenia's development and peace with Armenia, so we can kind of start reframing and rethinking Armenian security strategy, because I understand, empathetically, really, that there is this existential threat that a lot of Armenians are talking about. This is, their perception. That's why it's reality for them, But, from our perspective, and I can say—
I get that. I do get the nature of that. But go on to your second point then.
Second point is from Azerbaijan, as I expect the government in Azerbaijan and society in Azerbaijan, again, not to make the mistake that Armenia did in 90s. When you win the war, it doesn't mean you won the peace. So I think the most difficult part is starting now for Azerbaijan, to do things, as Richard said, with prisoners of war, to do things with prosecuting, and it should happen on both sides, the war crime. So transitional justice, but also a lot of other gestures that Azerbaijan as victorious side could do to try to reach out, to Armenia on some meta level, on a psychological level.
Emin, and both of you, listen, it's been absolutely fantastic discussion. Thank you both very much indeed. That's Emin Milli, who's speaking to us from Berlin, and Richard Giragosian, who is speaking to us from Yerevan. That's been a really, really informative discussion on Nagorno Karabakh.